The folder hit my mahogany desk with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp, final crack that seemed to splinter the very foundation of my world. For 5 years, I had lived in a curated silence, surrounded by the velvet wrapped lies of Julian, the man who had stepped into my son's shoes and promised to protect the only piece of David I had left. I looked down at the grainy, black and white photograph the investigator had slid across the polished wood, and my heart didn't just break, it stopped. There she was, not in the sun-drenched gardens of a Swiss boarding school, not in the gilded halls of a Parisian apartment, but huddled on a thin, stained mattress in the corner of a room that looked more like a cage than a home. Maya. She had David's eyes wide, searching, and filled with a haunted depth that no child should ever possess. Those eyes were staring directly into the camera lens, through the paper, and into my very soul, accusing me of a negligence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I am Eleanor Sterling, the matriarch of an empire built on steel and stoicism, yet in that moment I felt as fragile as a piece of spun glass caught in a gale. The air in my study, usually scented with the expensive aroma of old books and beeswax, suddenly felt cloying, stagnant with the stench of my own failure. Grace Street Shelter, the investigator whispered, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through my teeth. She's been there for 6 months, Eleanor. Julian hasn't paid a dime toward her care in years. The trust fund, the $2 million, it's gone, drained. The words were like poison being poured into my ear. $2 million, a drop in the bucket for the Sterling estate, but for a 10-year-old girl, it was supposed to be her shield against the world. Instead, it had become a target, a prize for a man whose charm I had mistaken for character. My hands, spotted with the marks of age but still strong, trembled as I reached for my coat. I didn't call for my maid, I didn't wait for a briefing. I simply moved, driven by a primal, frantic energy I hadn't felt since the night David died. The mansion, with its vaulted ceilings and silent corridors, felt like a mausoleum as I hurried toward the grand entrance. Every portrait of my ancestors seemed to turn their heads in judgment, their painted eyes tracking my desperate flight. I had failed the lineage. I had let a wolf into the nursery, and he had made off with the lamb while I sat here sipping tea and reviewing quarterly earnings. The heavy oak doors groaned as I pushed them open, and the night air hit me like a slap. It was raining, not a gentle spring mist, but a cold, relentless downpour that turned the manicured driveway into a river of obsidian. I didn't care. I didn't care about my silk blouse or the Italian leather of my shoes. I saw Arthur, my driver, startled by my sudden appearance, scrambling to open the door of the Rolls Royce. Grace Street, I barked, my voice cracking with a sharp, jagged edge. Drive as if your life depends on it, Arthur, because mine surely does. As the car surged forward, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge, I stared out at the blurred lights of the city. We were leaving the hills of the wealthy, descending into the belly of the city where the neon signs flickered like dying stars. My mind was a whirlwind of rage and guilt. How could I have been so blind? I had trusted Julian because he was the only link left to the family David had tried to build. I had wanted to believe in the fairy tale he spun in his monthly letters, letters that I now realized were nothing more than scripts written by a con artist. Every word about Maya's piano lessons, her French tutors, her laughter, it was all a fabrication designed to keep the checks flowing. I gripped the leather armrest until my knuckles turned white. The transition from the opulent suburbs to the decaying heart of the industrial district was jarring. The buildings grew taller, grimmer, their windows boarded up like blind eyes. This was the world where my granddaughter had been discarded. The Grace Street shelter appeared through the gloom, a squat brick building with peeling paint and a flickering light over the door that cast long, sickly shadows across the sidewalk. It looked like a place where hope went to be forgotten. As the car pulled to a stop, I didn't wait for Arthur. I threw the door open and stepped out into the rain, the cold water soaking through my clothes instantly, but I felt nothing but the fire of a grandmother's fury and the desperate, crushing need to find the girl with my son's eyes. I was coming for her, and God help anyone who stood in my way. The transition from the interior of my limousine to the interior of the Gray Street shelter was not merely a change of scenery, it was a violent shift in reality. The air inside the Rolls Royce had been a curated sanctuary, smelling of rich Connolly leather, the faint, woody spice of my perfume, and the hushed silence of absolute insulation. But as the heavy steel door of the shelter groaned open, that sanctuary was obliterated. The air that rushed to meet me was thick and clinical, a suffocating cocktail of industrial strength bleach, unwashed bodies, and the damp, metallic tang of old, overworked radiators. It felt heavy in my lungs, a physical weight that seemed to coat the back of my throat. I stepped onto the linoleum floor, which had once been white but was now a jaundiced yellow, crisscrossed with deep black scuffs and peeling at the edges like sunburnt skin. Each click of my designer heels echoed against the low, water-stained ceilings, sounding obscenely loud, a rhythmic, sharp intrusion of wealth into a place designed for the forgotten. People were lined up along the hallways, slumped against the cinder block walls in various states of exhaustion. Some stared at their feet with a hollowed-out focus, while others looked up at me, their eyes flickering with a mixture of resentment and a weary, distant curiosity. They saw the cut of my wool coat, a bespoke charcoal piece that cost more than most of them would earn in a decade, and I felt the weight of their silent judgment. It was a localized gravity, a pressure that made my shoulders ache under the fabric. Elinor Sterling, a woman who commanded boardrooms and dictated the flow of international markets, felt smaller than I ever had in my 70 years. The billions in my bank accounts, the steel mills, the shipping lanes, they all felt like light weights, useless and mocking in the face of this stark human misery. I was met near a cramped security desk by a woman whose face was a map of deep-set lines and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ever cure. Her name tag, pinned crookedly to a faded polo shirt, read Martha. She looked at my coat, then up at my face, her eyes narrowing with a suspicion so sharp it felt like a physical probe. She didn't see a grieving grandmother, she saw a predator or a tourist. "We don't get many visitors in silk and cashmere at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday," she said, her voice a dry, gravelly rasp. "Are you lost, or are you looking for a tax-deductible photo op?" I didn't flinch, though the words stung with the precision of a practiced insult. "I'm looking for Maya Sterling," I said, her name tasting like ash and iron in my mouth. "She's my granddaughter." Martha's expression didn't soften. If anything, her features tightened, a wall of professional skepticism rising between us. The silence that followed was filled only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of an industrial laundry machine and the low, disjointed murmur of voices from the common area. She didn't ask where I'd been for the last 3 years. She didn't need to ask why a Sterling was sleeping on a cot while I was sleeping on Egyptian cotton. The answer was written in the pristine condition of my gloves and the desperate late arrival panic that I knew was visible in my eyes. I was a woman who had failed the only thing that mattered, and Martha knew it. "She's in the dining hall," Martha finally said, her voice dropping the edge but retaining its coldness. "Breakfast service ended 20 minutes ago, but she likes to stay behind. She doesn't like the crowds in the sleeping quarters." She led me down a hallway where the smell of bleach intensified, trying and failing to mask the scent of scorched oatmeal. We reached a set of double doors with reinforced glass, and as Martha pushed them open, the noise changed, a cacophony of plastic trays clattering and the low, echoing drone of people who had nowhere else to be. The room was bathed in the flickering, sickly green light of overhead fluorescence that made everyone's skin look translucent and gray. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from face to face, searching for a ghost of David, a glimmer of the sterling jawline, a spark of the light I remembered from the little girl who used to hide in the hydrangeas of my garden. And then I saw her. She was tucked into the furthest corner of the room, as far away from the center of the hall as the walls would allow. She was much smaller than she had looked in the private investigator's grainy, long lens photo, a waif-like figure swallowed by an oversized, pilled gray sweatshirt that hung off her bony shoulders. She sat with a protective, hunched posture, her spine curved like a bow, her shoulders pulled up toward her ears as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible to become a shadow among shadows. Before her sat a scratched plastic tray containing a mound of lukewarm stew, a muddy, unidentifiable brown concoction. She wasn't eating it. She was stirring it listlessly with a plastic spoon, her gaze fixed on the steam that had long ago stopped rising. She held the tray with both hands, her knuckles white, guarding it with a quiet, feral intensity. She was a 10-year-old girl who had learned the hard way that in this world, even a tray of slop could be taken if you weren't vigilant. The sight of her, my blood, my son's legacy, the only living piece of David left on this earth, sitting in that grim, fluorescent lit corner, broke something inside me that I hadn't realized was still intact. The billionaire matriarch, the woman of steel, vanished in a heartbeat, leaving only a hollowed-out, grieving grandmother who realized with a soul-crushing clarity that all her money hadn't been enough to buy the one thing that mattered, the safety of a child I had sworn to protect. I forced my feet to move, the soles of my designer pumps clicking with a jarring, rhythmic arrogance against the stained linoleum floor. Every step felt like an intrusion, a violent disruption of the heavy, stagnant air that hung over the room. The scent of bleach was losing its battle against the more pervasive odors of unwashed wool, damp cardboard, and the metallic tang of the industrial-grade stew. In the background, a television mounted high on the wall hissed with a low, distorted hum of static, the picture flickering through a news broadcast that seemed to belong to a different planet entirely. I felt the weight of every eye in that room, dozens of hollow, weary gazes tracking the woman in the camel hair coat as I approached the girl in the corner. Maya didn't look up, not at first. She was a study in stillness, her entire being concentrated on the slow, mechanical movement of her plastic spoon through the cooling sludge on her tray. As I got closer, the details I had missed from across the room began to sharpen with a cruel, agonizing clarity. The oversized gray hoodie wasn't just pilled, it was shredded at the cuffs, the threads hanging like weeping sores. Her hands, once small and soft, were chapped and red, the knuckles dusted with the gray grime of the streets. Her cheeks, which should have been round with the soft bloom of 10-year-old innocence, were hollowed out, the skin stretched tight over a jawline that was a haunting, skeletal echo of my son's. "Maya," I whispered. My voice felt brittle, a thin glass thread that threatened to shatter before it reached her. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. She flinched so hard the plastic spoon clattered onto the tray, splashing a drop of brown liquid onto her sleeve. She didn't look at me with curiosity or hope. She recoiled, her back hitting the cinder block wall with a dull thud. Her eyes, David's eyes, that deep, stormy gray I had seen every day for 30 years, were wide and frantic, darting toward the exit and then back to me. They were the eyes of a creature that had spent too long being hunted. I don't have it, she rasped, her voice a dry, sandpaper ghost of the melodic laughter I remembered. I told them, I don't have anything left, go away. The words hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. My heart didn't just ache, it felt as though it were physically fracturing, the shards piercing my lungs. I reached out a hand, a reflexive gesture of comfort, but I froze when I saw her pull her knees up to her chest, shielding her face with her thin arms. She thought I was a social worker coming to drag her to another cold intake center, or worse, one of the predators who prowled the edges of the shelters looking for the vulnerable. To her, I wasn't family, I was a threat. Maya, sweetheart, look at me, I said, fighting with every ounce of my willpower to keep my voice from breaking into a sob. I had to be the anchor. I had to be the sterling matriarch now, even if I felt like a crumbling ruin inside. It's me, it's Alina, your grandmother. She slowly lowered her arms, but the suspicion didn't leave her face. She squinted at me through the flickering green light of the fluorescence, her brow furrowing in a way that made her look 40 years older than she was. My grandmother is dead, she said flatly. Everyone is dead. You're just another one from the office. You're looking for the papers, aren't you? The ones the man in the suit asked about. The air in my lungs turned to ice. The man in the suit. The $2 million trust fund David had set up for her, the money that should have ensured she never saw the inside of a place like this, flashed through my mind. Someone had been here. Someone had been looking for her, not to save her, but to harvest what was left of her inheritance. No, Maya, I'm not from any office, I said, sinking slowly to my knees on the sticky floor, ignoring the ruin of my skirt. I needed to be on her level. I needed her to see the truth in my eyes. Do you remember the garden with the big blue hydrangeas? You used to hide your plastic dinosaurs in the dirt under the bushes, and David, your dad, would pretend he couldn't find them until you jumped out and scared him. The mention of her father caused a flicker of something, not recognition, not yet, but a momentary softening of the jagged edges of her fear. She looked at my face, really looked at me, her gaze traveling over my brow and my mouth. The TV static behind us swelled for a moment, a harsh, white noise roar that seemed to underscore the absurdity of our reunion in this purgatory. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, offering her the only thing I had left, the truth of a woman who had finally, desperately, found her way home to the only person who mattered. I'm David's mother, Maya. I've been looking for you for so long. Please just look at me. The flickering light above us hummed, a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate in my teeth, echoing the frantic thrumming of my heart. Maya's gaze didn't soften as I expected. The flicker of recognition I'd hoped for didn't bloom into a hug or a tearful reunion. Instead, the fear I had seen earlier curdled into something far more terrifying, a cold, calcified resentment that made her eyes look like two chips of flint. She didn't reach out, she didn't weep. She simply leaned back against the cinder blocks, her posture stiffening until she looked like she was made of the same unyielding stone as the wall behind her. The hydrangeas, she repeated. Her voice was flat, stripped of the melodic cadence of childhood, replaced by a dry, rhythmic rasp. I remember. I also remember the night the lights went out in the big house because the bills weren't paid. I remember the night Mom stopped breathing and the way the room smelled like metallic pennies and old hospital air because we couldn't afford the hospice nurse anymore. She leaned forward then, and for the first time I saw the full weight of the person she had become. The girl I had lost, the one who wore velvet hair bows and smelled of strawberry shampoo, was gone. In her place was a survivor who had been forged in a furnace I couldn't even imagine. Julian told me there was nothing, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut through the noise of the shelter like a serrated blade. The day after the funeral, he didn't even wait for the flowers to wilt. He told me the trust was empty. He said David, my father, had gambled it all away or lost it in bad deals. He told me the house belonged to the bank and that I was a burden he couldn't afford to carry. He said you had washed your hands of us both. I felt a sickening lurch in my stomach, a cold wave of nausea that made my head spin. Julian, my son-in-law, the man who had stood at David's funeral and wept into a silk handkerchief while I held his hand, offering him the strength of the sterling name. I had trusted him to be the bridge to my granddaughter, to be the steward of the $2 million legacy David had left behind, and instead, he had been the one to burn the bridge while she was still standing on it. He kicked me out, Alina, she said, using my name as if it were a foreign word she found distasteful, a bitter pill she was forced to swallow. He drove me to the Greyhound station in the middle of the night. He gave me a $50 bill and told me to find a cousin in the city I'd never met. Only there was no cousin. There was just the terminal and the people who wait there for girls who have nowhere to go. She began to describe those first few weeks, and as she spoke, the world of wealth and influence I inhabited seemed to dissolve into ash. I saw the Greyhound station through her eyes, the fluorescent glare that never turned off, the smell of diesel exhaust and ancient, unwashed desperation, the way she had learned to sleep sitting upright with her backpack straps looped around her ankles so no one could pull it away without waking her. She told me about the dark, not the gentle, velvet dark of a bedroom, but the predatory, living dark of an alleyway where every shadow had teeth and every footstep was a threat. You were building skyscrapers, she said, her eyes tracing the expensive Italian wool of my coat with a look of profound, stomach-turning disgust. I saw your face in the Sunday papers sometimes, in the trash cans I used for warmth. You were at galas. You were cutting ribbons on new developments, smiling for the cameras in diamonds that could have paid for 1,000 nights in a hotel, and I was learning how to be invisible. I learned that if you don't make eye contact, people think you're a ghost. If you stay in the deep shadows of the bus stalls, the transit cops don't see you. I became an expert at disappearing while you were making sure everyone in this city knew your name. The guilt was a physical weight, a mountain of jagged stones settling onto my chest, stealing my breath. I had been so focused on the legacy, on the Sterling Empire, on the big picture of corporate dominance, that I had missed the most vital, microscopic detail of my own blood suffering in the gutters of the city I claimed to own. I had built monuments to my own success while my granddaughter was learning the geography of the vents that blew warm air from the subways. Maya, I didn't know, I choked out, the words feeling pathetic and hollow even as they left my lips. I thought, Julian told me you were at a private boarding school in Switzerland. He sent me letters, Maya. He sent photos of a girl in a uniform who looked just like you. I thought you were safe. I thought you were being taken care of. He's a liar, she snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, violent heat. And you were too busy to check. You were too busy being a billionaire to be a grandmother. She wasn't wrong. The realization was a bitter pill that stuck in my throat, tasting of copper and shame. I reached out again, my fingers trembling, desperate to bridge the chasm of years and trauma that lay between us. It doesn't matter now. I'm here. I'm taking you home. You'll be safe, Maya. I promise you I will spend every second of the rest of my life making sure you are safe and warm and fed. You'll never have to look over your shoulder again. You'll never have to sleep in a place like this. Maya didn't cry, she didn't fall into my arms. Instead, she let out a short, jagged bark of a laugh, a sound so cynical and hollow it made my skin crawl. Safe, she scoffed, the word dripping with acid. You think a big house and a locked door makes someone safe. You think your money can fix what the night does to a person's soul. She reached out and grabbed my hand, but not in affection. She flipped her own hands over, palms up, and shoved them toward my face, forcing me to look at the wreckage. The skin was a horror show of labor and neglect. Her palms were a map of trauma, thick, yellowed calluses that looked like scales, crisscrossed with deep, angry red fissures that had bled and scabbed over a dozen times. There were burn scars on her forearms, jagged and silver against her pale, translucent skin. Illegal kitchen shifts, she hissed, her eyes boring into mine with a ferocity that made me want to flinch. 12 hours a day standing over industrial fryers for $3 an hour under the table because I didn't have ID. My hands are like this because I had to scrub floors with lye and move boiling pots that were heavier than I am while the managers threatened to call the cops if I slowed down. I don't need your safety, Eleanor. I stopped needing anything from you the third night I spent sleeping in a cardboard box behind a dumpster while you were probably toasting to your year-end profits. I stared at those hands, the hands of a child who had been forced to become a machine, and I realized with a crushing, soul-deep finality that finding her was only the beginning of my penance. I hadn't just lost a granddaughter. I had helped create a stranger who looked at love as a luxury she could no longer afford, and at me as the person who had let the fire burn her. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I tried to touch the rough, scarred skin of her knuckles, but she pulled back as if my skin were made of ice. The silence between us was heavy, filled only by the distant, rhythmic thumping of a radiator and the wet, hacking cough of someone in a nearby cot. We were sitting in a cramped, shadowed corner of the shelter's common room, a place where the air tasted of stale floor wax and old, unwashed coats. It was here, in this purgatory of the forgotten, that I had to tell her the truth about the life that had been stolen from her. I had to tell her about the money. Maya, I began, my voice thick with a residue of tears I refused to let fall. There is a reason Julian did this. There is a reason he kept you in the dark and pushed you into the streets. It wasn't just cruelty, though God knows he has enough of that in his marrow. It was greed. Your father, my son, he didn't leave you with nothing. He left a trust fund, Maya, $2 million held in a locked account that was supposed to be released to you on your 18th birthday. The reaction wasn't what I expected. She didn't gasp, she didn't look hopeful. Instead, her face went deathly pale, a sickly, translucent white that made the dark circles under her eyes look like bruises. She stared at me, her chest heaving slightly under the thin, tattered fabric of her hoodie. 2 million. She whispered, the number sounding foreign, like a word from a dead language. Then a sharp, jagged memory seemed to pierce through her. She shook her head, her movements jerky and panicked. No, no, he told me. He told me there were debts. He said Dad died in the red. He said I owed him for the roof over my head. He lied, I said, and the word felt like a hot coal in my mouth. I felt a slow, boiling heat beginning to rise from the pit of my stomach, a physical sensation of rage that I hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't the cold, calculated anger of a boardroom dispute. It was a primal, searing heat that scorched my veins. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a trapped bird demanding blood. He manipulated the estate. He was the executor, and he used that power to bury the truth. But that money is yours, Maya. It's sitting there accruing interest while you've been scrubbing floors for pennies. Maya let out a dry, rattling breath. She leaned forward, her eyes darting around the room as if Julian himself might emerge from the shadows. He made me sign things, Nana, she said, the childhood name slipping out and cutting through me like a blade. A week before I turned 18, he brought a man to the house. A lawyer or someone who looked like one. He told me they were medical papers. He said that because of my instability, because I was grieving and difficult, I needed to sign documents that would allow him to manage my health care. He said if I didn't sign them, he'd have me taken away that night. I felt the air leave my lungs. Medical papers. He threatened me, she whispered, her voice cracking. He told me that if I ever tried to claim a cent of my father's name, or if I ever told anyone about how he treated me, he would use those papers to have me committed. He said he had signatures from doctors I'd never even met. He told me the papers proved I was a danger to myself. He said he'd put me in a state facility where I'd never see the sun again, and that no one would ever believe a crazy girl over a man of his standing. The heat in my chest turned into a roaring inferno. I looked at my granddaughter, this brilliant, broken girl who had been silenced by the very person who was supposed to protect her. Julian hadn't just stolen her inheritance, he had weaponized her own sanity against her. He had forged a paper trail of madness to ensure she remained a ghost, unable to ever haunt his bank accounts. I reached out and took her hand, and this time I didn't let her pull away. My grip was firm, the grip of a woman who had built empires and was now prepared to burn one to the ground. He can't use those papers, Maya, I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He thinks he's a lion, but he's forgotten who taught him how to hunt. I am Eleanor Sterling, and I promise you, by the time I am finished with him, those papers won't be worth the ink he used to forge them. You aren't going to a facility, you're going home. And Julian is going to learn exactly what happens when you steal from a Sterling. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the girl she used to be behind the wall of trauma. The boiling heat in my blood didn't subside. It settled into a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't just her grandmother anymore. I was her architect, and I was going to rebuild her life stone by stone while I dismantled his. The drive to the St. Regis was conducted in a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the roof of the town car. Maya sat huddled against the door, her knees pulled up to her chest, her eyes fixed on the blurring lights of the city as if she expected the shadows to reach out and pull her back to the shelter. She was vibrating, a low, constant tremor that I could feel through the leather upholstery. To her, the shelter was a cage, but it was a cage she understood. This car, the driver's silent professionalism, the sheer, unadulterated wealth of the surroundings, this was a foreign landscape, and she was terrified of the customs. When we reached the suite, the bellhop took one look at her, grimy, smelling of stale rain and desperation, and his professional mask didn't even flicker. That is what money buys, the privilege of not being judged when you bring the broken pieces of your life into a five-star lobby. I led her through the foyer of the presidential suite, past the grand piano and the silk-covered divans, and straight into the master bathroom. It was a cavern of white calicut marble and brushed gold, illuminated by a soft, recessed glow that made the space feel like a sanctuary. Maya stopped at the threshold, her breath hitching. I didn't say a word. I simply turned on the water in the deep, freestanding soaking tub. I poured in an oil that smelled of sandalwood and honey, watching the steam rise in fragrant plumes. I can't, Nana, I'll ruin it, she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. She was looking at the plush, ivory-colored rug beneath her feet as if it were a minefield. Nothing here is more valuable than you, Maya, I said, my voice firm. Strip, give me your clothes, all of them. She obeyed with a listless, mechanical motion, shedding the tattered hoodie and the jeans that were worn thin at the knees. Seeing her clearly under the bright vanity lights was a fresh assault on my heart. She was a map of neglect, ribs protruding like the hulls of wrecked ships, skin sallow and dry, and a series of faint, jagged scars on her forearms that made my vision blur with a sudden hot moisture. I helped her into the water. She let out a small, wounded sound as the heat hit her skin, but then she sank into the bubbles, her eyes closing. I took a sponge and began to wash her. I washed the grime of the streets from her neck. I scrubbed the charcoal dust from under her fingernails. I worked with the methodical care of an archaeologist uncovering a precious, damaged statue. When it came time to dry her, I pulled a towel from the warming rack. She stared at the towel as if it were an alien artifact. It was a thick, high-pile Egyptian cotton, so heavy and soft it felt like a cloud. She reached out, touching the fibers with a trembling hand, her eyes widening. In the shelter, towels were thin, scratchy rags that smelled of industrial bleach and shared misery. This was something else entirely, a symbol of a world that cared about comfort, a world she had been exiled from for years. She wrapped it around herself, buried her face in the warmth of the fabric, and for the first time she wept. Not the loud, jagged sobs of a child, but the silent, heaving release of someone who has finally stopped running. I got her into a pair of silk pajamas and tucked her into the king-sized bed. She looked so small amidst the sea of 500 thread count linens, a tiny island of trauma in a vast ocean of luxury. Within minutes, the exhaustion claimed her, and her breathing leveled out into the deep, rhythmic cadence of the truly spent. I didn't sleep. I walked into the living area, the city lights shimmering through the floor to ceiling windows like a spilled box of diamonds. I took out my phone and dialed Marcus, my lead counsel. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the I need the full breakdown of the Sterling Vein Trust, I said, my voice cold and sharp as a razor. Not the summary. I want the original bylaws and every amendment Julian filed in the last 5 years. I have them pulled up, Alina, Marcus replied, the clicking of keys audible in the background. I was looking at the 2021 amendment. Julian filed it under a protection of assets petition. He claimed Maya was suffering from chronic, treatment-resistant psychosis. Go on, I commanded, my grip tightening on the phone. There's a reversionary clause, Alina. It's buried in the fine print of Section 4B. It states that in the event the beneficiary, Maya, is declared permanently mentally unfit by a court-appointed guardian, the trust doesn't just stay in limbo. The entire principal, including the accrued interest, which is now sitting at approximately 2.4 million, reverts in its entirety to the legal guardian, to Julian. The air in the room seemed to turn to ice. So he didn't just want her gone, I whispered, the realization settling into my marrow with a sickening thud. He was actively manufacturing her unfitness. He wasn't just hiding her in shelters. He was ensuring she stayed broken, stayed unmedicated, stayed crazy in the eyes of the law so he could trigger that clause and swallow her father's legacy whole. Precisely, Marcus said. If she showed up sane and healthy on her 18th birthday, he lost everything. If she showed up broken or didn't show up at all, he became a very wealthy man. He's been playing a long game, Alina. He's been setting the stage to steal her life's blood. I looked through the open bedroom door at the silhouette of my granddaughter. Julian hadn't just been a cruel uncle, he had been a predator, stalking a child through the tall grass of her own grief. He had weaponized her pain to line his pockets. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. I want every doctor who signed those papers investigated. I want Julian's bank records for the last decade. And I want a petition for emergency temporary guardianship filed by 9:00 a.m. We aren't just going to sue him. We are going to dismantle him. The morning sun was a cruel, bright blade cutting through the heavy silk curtains of the penthouse. I hadn't slept a wink, but the adrenaline of a looming war kept my spine straight and my mind focused. I watched Maya as she sat at the edge of the guest bed, her fingers tracing the intricate embroidery on the navy cashmere sweater I'd laid out for her. It was a piece from my own collection, a bit large for her slight frame, but the deep, authoritative color made her pale skin look less like translucent paper and more like fine porcelain. She looked fragile, like a doll that had been broken and glued back together with visible silver-lined seams. When we arrived at Sterling Heights, the building itself felt like an extension of my own will, a monolith of smoked glass and brushed steel that pierced the gray morning sky. It was designed to intimidate, to remind anyone who entered that they were in a place where fortunes were made and lives were redirected with the stroke of a pen. We stepped into the lobby, a vast cathedral of commerce where the air was filtered and smelled faintly of expensive lilies and floor wax. Maya shrank into herself, her shoulders hitching up toward her ears as if she expected the polished marble floors to open up and swallow her whole. In her borrowed clothes, the oversized sweater and tailored wool trousers I'd had to cinch with a vintage leather belt, she looked painfully out of place. She moved with the skittish, heartbreaking grace of a stray cat, her eyes darting toward the stone-faced security guards, then back to the floor. She was a ghost in a temple of gold, and I felt a fresh surge of hot, protective rage that she felt like a trespasser in a world that should have been her birthright. We ascended to the 40th floor in a silent, high-speed elevator that made the air pressure shift and my ears pop. Marcus was already waiting in my private conference room. The walls were all glass, offering a panoramic, dizzying view of the city that had chewed Maya up and spat her out. Marcus didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew me too well for that. He had a stack of manila folders laid out on the mahogany table, each one a heavy brick in the wall Julian had built around my granddaughter. "It's worse than we thought, Alina," Marcus said, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that usually calmed me but today felt like the tolling of a funeral bell. Slid a document toward us, the paper crisp and white against the dark wood. "These are medical records from the Northwood Psychiatric Institute. They date back 3 years." I leaned in, but it was Maya who reached out first. Her hand was shaking so violently that the paper rattled as she pulled it closer. I saw the words in bold, black ink, stark and unforgiving: patient, Maya Vane, diagnosis, chronic treatment, resistant schizophrenia, prognosis, permanent cognitive decline. I don't understand, Maya whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. "I've never been to Northwood. I've never seen this doctor. Dr. Eris Thorne? I don't know who that is. I've never heard that name in my life." "You wouldn't have," Marcus said, his eyes softening with a rare flicker of genuine pity as he looked at her. "Dr. Thorne is a paid consultant for several of Julian's holding companies. He didn't need to see you, Maya. He just needed to sign the papers Julian provided. These reports claim you were prone to violent outbursts, that you heard voices commanding you to self-harm, and that you were entirely detached from reality. They even fabricated pharmacy records, heavy doses of clozapine and risperidone supposedly administered to you while you were in his care before you ran away." I watched Maya's face. It wasn't just shock that registered. It was a slow, agonizing realization that settled into her features, aging her by a decade in a matter of seconds. She stared at the word schizophrenia as if it were a brand burned into her skin. She wasn't just a runaway to Julian. She wasn't just an inconvenience or a burden he wanted to shed. He had systematically stripped her of her sanity on paper, ensuring that if she ever did try to come forward, no one would believe a word she said. He had created a paper trail of madness that would have held up in any court in the country. He hadn't just wanted her out of the house, he wanted her erased from the human race, a non-person whose testimony would be legally worthless. "He made me a ghost," she murmured, her eyes welling with tears that she refused to let fall. "If I had died in that shelter, these papers would have been my only biography. Everyone would have thought I was crazy, that I deserved to be lost, that I was just another broken girl who couldn't handle the world." I put my hand over hers, feeling the icy coldness of her skin through the cashmere. He didn't make you a ghost, Maya. He made himself a target. I looked at Marcus, my eyes narrowing. How do we corner him? If we just file the guardianship papers now, he'll know we've found her. He'll bury the money in offshore accounts. He'll bribe Thorne to disappear to a country without an extradition treaty, and he'll fight us with every cent of the trust. We can't give him a chance to flee. Marcus nodded, a shark like grin touching his lips. We need his own greed to betray him. We need a confession on record, something that proves he knew she was sane and healthy while he was filing these reports. We need to lure him into a room where he thinks he's finally winning, where his guard is down because he believes he's about to touch the finish line. The 18th birthday, I said, the plan forming in my mind with clinical, cold-blooded precision. It's in 3 days. He's expecting to trigger the reversionary clause the moment the clock strikes midnight. He thinks he's about to inherit $2.4 million. Let's invite him here to Sterling Heights for a final audit of the trust. We'll tell him there's a minor administrative discrepancy that requires his signature to release the full principal to his personal accounts. He won't be able to resist the lure of that much cash. He'll come running. And Maya? Marcus asked, glancing at her. I looked at my granddaughter. She was staring out at the city, her jaw tightening. The fear was still there, visible in the way she gripped the edge of the table, but beneath it, a new heat was rising, a spark of the sterling fire I thought had been extinguished by years of abuse. Maya will be the surprise witness to her own resurrection, I said. We'll have the recorders running, the cameras live, and the police on standby in the next room. We aren't just going to take the money back, Marcus. We're going to watch him realize that the girl he tried to bury is the one who's going to dig his grave. Maya looked at me, and for the first time, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a survivor who had finally found her weapon. I want to be there, she said, her voice small but firm, cutting through the silence of the office. I want to see his face when he realizes I'm still here and that I remember everything. The air in the back of the Mercedes felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the sheer presence of the man who had just pulled into the shelter's cracked asphalt lot. We had returned to the mission to gather the last of Maya's meager belongings, a single plastic bin of clothes and a notebook, before retreating to the fortified sanctuary of my estate. I had stayed in the car to finalize a wire transfer with Marcus, while Maya and a security detail went inside. I didn't expect him to show up. I didn't think his desperation had reached this fever pitch yet, but as the silver Audi Q8 glided to a halt 10 yards away, the realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Julian stepped out of the vehicle with the practiced grace of a man who knew he was being watched, even when he wasn't. He looked exactly as he had the last time I'd seen him at a charity gala in the city, polished, impeccably tailored in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than the shelter's annual heating budget, and radiating a carefully cultivated aura of tragic nobility. He was the picture of a grieving, exhausted father, his hair just slightly tousled to suggest sleepless nights, his expression a mask of weary determination. I watched him through the heavy tint of my window, my fingers digging into the buttery leather of the armrest until my knuckles turned white. My breath hitched in my throat, and a bitter, acidic bile rose up, burning my esophagus. For 5 years, this man had been my primary link to my daughter's memory. For 5 years, I had read his letters, listened to his soft-spoken updates about Maya's rebellion and her troubled mind, and I had believed him. I had sent him checks, I had offered him my sympathy, and I had allowed him to gatekeep my own flesh and blood. Looking at him now, seeing the calculated way he adjusted his cuffs before approaching Martha at the front door, I felt a level of self-loathing that nearly choked me. I had been a titan of industry, a woman who could sniff out a corporate lie from 1,000 miles away, yet I had let this sociopath play me like a cheap violin. Martha had come out to meet him, her face etched with the exhaustion of a woman who dealt with the world's discarded souls every day. I saw Julian's posture shift the moment he engaged her. He leaned in slightly, a subtle move designed to create an illusion of intimacy and trust. He placed a hand on his chest, right over his heart, and I didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what he was saying. "I'm looking for my daughter," he would be telling her, his voice likely cracking with a rehearsed tremor. "She's very sick. She's been off her medication for weeks, and we're so worried she's going to hurt herself. I heard a wealthy woman was here asking about her. I'm terrified she's being taken advantage of in her state." The sheer audacity of it made my head spin. He wasn't just looking for her, he was preemptively poisoning the well. He was using the very lies he'd filed in those medical reports, the schizophrenia, the violent outbursts, to ensure that anyone who tried to help Maya would view her as a liability rather than a victim. He was painting himself as the savior and me as a potential predator or a confused interloper. I watched Martha's expression soften. She was a good woman, but she was human, and Julian was a predator who specialized in the human heart's vulnerabilities. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, likely a shot of Maya from years ago, looking happy and healthy, and held it out with a hand that seemed to tremble. It was a masterpiece of deception. I wanted to throw the car door open and scream the truth at the top of my lungs, but I forced myself to stay still. I had to see this. I had to witness the monster in his natural habitat so I would never, ever forget what we were up against. His eyes scanned the parking lot, lingering for a fraction of a second on my car. My heart hammered against my ribs. The windows were opaque from the outside, but I felt his gaze like a cold needle pricking my skin. He was looking for the wealthy woman. He was looking for the threat to his $2 million windfall. In that moment, the mask slipped just for a heartbeat. As Martha turned her head to check a clipboard, Julian's face went blank. The warmth vanished, the grieving father evaporated, and what was left was a cold, predatory vacuum. He wasn't a man, he was a ledger, calculating the cost of his next move and the risk of his exposure. I realized then that the letters he'd sent me weren't just lies, they were a roadmap of his contempt for me. He thought I was old, soft, and easily manipulated by the ghost of my daughter. He thought he could bury Maya in the dirt of this neighborhood, and I would just keep writing the checks until the trust reverted to him. The bile in my throat turned to a cold, hard knot of resolve. He had no idea that the wealthy woman wasn't just a stranger. He had no idea that the lioness was already in the tall grass, watching him stumble toward his own destruction. I watched him take Martha's hand in a gesture of profound gratitude, and I whispered a vow to the empty car. "Enjoy the performance, Julian. It's the last one you'll ever give." The heavy car door clicked shut behind me, a sound that felt as final as a gavel hitting a mahogany bench. I stepped out of the shadows of the tinted glass, my heels clicking sharply against the wet asphalt. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the metallic tang of exhaust fumes lingering from a passing truck. I didn't rush. A woman of my stature never rushes. We arrive. Julian was still standing near Martha, his hand lingering on her arm in that practiced, patronizing way of his, but the moment the sound of my footsteps reached him, his shoulders stiffened. He turned, the practiced mask of the grieving father still pinned to his face, but as his eyes landed on me, really landed on me, I watched the artifice shatter. It was a beautiful thing to witness. The color drained from his lips first, then his cheeks, leaving him a sallow, sickly shade of parchment. For a fraction of a second, the raw, unadulterated terror of a trapped animal flared in his pupils. He hadn't expected me to be here, not in the flesh, and certainly not standing between him and the girl he had tried to erase. He looked as though he wanted to bolt, but his feet were anchored to the grime-streaked pavement by the sheer weight of my presence. Elena, he stammered, his voice losing its rehearsed resonance. He tried to recover, pulling his shoulders back, attempting to summon the charm that had fooled me for half a decade. I didn't realize you were in the city. You shouldn't be here in this neighborhood. It's not safe. It's dangerous for someone of your age and position. I didn't answer him immediately. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, as I walked toward him. I could feel Maya's eyes on me from the car window, a silent witness to the collision of her two worlds. I stopped just a few feet from him, close enough to smell the expensive cologne he used to mask the scent of his own desperation. I looked him up and down, making sure he felt every bit of the contempt I was currently vibrating with. "Safe, Julian," I echoed, my voice a low, dangerous purr. Safety is an interesting word coming from you. I've spent the last hour looking into the eyes of a girl who has been living in fear because of the man who was supposed to protect her. I've been looking at the safety you provided for my granddaughter, and it looks remarkably like a prison cell disguised as a shelter. He let out a sharp, nervous laugh, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He glanced at Martha, trying to gauge how much she had heard, how much she understood. "Elena, you don't understand the full picture. She's unwell. I've been acting under the strictest medical advice. Her placement here, it was for her own protection, a temporary measure until we could find a more permanent facility. She was a danger to herself, to the family reputation. I was trying to spare you the pain of seeing her like this, in this state of decline." Medical advice? I tilted my head, mocking him with a cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Is that what you call the forged signatures on those commitment papers? Is that the protection you offered her while you were busy drafting letters to me about her supposed descent into madness? You spoke of her troubled mind as if it were a tragedy you were enduring, rather than a narrative you were carefully constructing." His eyes flickered toward Martha, who was standing frozen, her gaze darting between us as the reality of the situation began to dawn on her. He realized he was losing the narrative. He stepped toward me, lowering his voice, trying to regain the upper hand through a pathetic attempt at intimacy. "You're overstepping, Elena. I am her father. I have the legal authority here. You're an old woman who's been misled by a girl who doesn't know what's real anymore. Don't let your grief cloud your judgment. She's manipulative." I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Let's talk about legal authority, Julian. Let's talk about the incapacity clause in the trust agreement. The one that states if Maya is declared mentally unfit, the management of her $2 million fund reverts entirely to you. Did you think I wouldn't read the fine print of my own daughter's legacy? Did you think I wouldn't notice the correlation between your medical concerns and the date the trust was set to vest? The transformation was instantaneous. The last vestige of his composure evaporated. His face turned a truly hideous shade of gray, the color of wet cement. His jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to hang loose, his mouth working silently as he searched for a lie big enough to cover a hole that deep. The predator was gone, replaced by a man who realized he had just walked into a trap of his own making. He looked at the car, at the silhouette of the daughter he had tried to sell for $2 million, and for the first time in his life, Julian had nothing to say. I watched the sweat bead on his forehead, a physical manifestation of the walls closing in. He wasn't just a liar anymore, he was a ghost, haunted by the very greed that had driven him to this gutter. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I watched the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed his pride, or what was left of it, and I turned my back on him with a finality that felt like a gavel striking wood. I signaled to Thomas, my driver, who stepped out of the car with the silent, looming authority of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and remained unimpressed. He placed himself between me and Julian, a human shield of iron and dark wool. I climbed back into the car, the door clicking shut with a heavy, expensive thud that severed the connection between the predator and his prey. 48 hours later, the atmosphere in my executive boardroom was thick enough to choke on. The room was a cathedral of industry, polished mahogany tables that stretched like a dark river under the recessed lighting, floor to ceiling windows that looked out over a city that seemed indifferent to the tragedy unfolding within these walls. The air was pressurized, smelling of the bitter, dark roast coffee my assistant, Clara, meticulously prepares, and the faint, chemical scent of expensive stationery. Dr. Aris Thorne sat at the far end of the table, his fingers nervously drumming against a leather-bound folder. He was a man who had clearly traded his Hippocratic oath for a summer home in the Hamptons, and it showed in the way he wouldn't meet my gaze. His skin had a sallow, waxy sheen under the LED lights, and he kept adjusting his silk tie as if it were a noose. Beside him were the three trustees of my daughter's estate, men I had known for decades, men who had sat at my dinner table and toasted to the family's health while they were busy looking the other way. They sat in a row, a triptych of calculated indifference, their hands folded over legal briefs that rustled with every shallow breath they took. Maya sat to my right. She was wearing a soft cashmere sweater I'd bought her the day before, a pale lavender that made her look even more ethereal and fragile against the harsh corporate backdrop. Under the table, her hand was a cold, trembling bird. I took it in mine, my thumb tracing the delicate, harrowing architecture of her knuckles. I could feel the thinness of her skin, the way her bones seemed almost porous from the months of neglect and the chemical fog Julian had forced upon her. I squeezed her hand, a silent promise that I was the wall between her and the wolves. I could feel her heart rate through her palm, rapid, fluttering, terrified. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic snap of a briefcase. My lead counsel, Sarah, leaned forward, her expression as sharp as the crease in her charcoal trousers. She didn't offer pleasantries. She didn't offer coffee. We are here to discuss the immediate and irrevocable removal of Julian Vance as a legal guardian and the full restoration of Maya's access to the trust. She began, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel through soft tissue. Julian, sitting opposite us, tried to summon a ghost of his former bravado. He looked older today, the lines around his eyes etched deep by a lack of sleep and the dawning realization that his empire of cards was collapsing. He had tried to dress the part of the grieving, concerned father, but the suit looked a size too large now, as if he were shrinking into the vacuum of his own lies. "This is an ambush, Elainer," he hissed, his voice cracking, losing that rehearsed resonance he used to charm the socialites. "You're using your influence, your money, to bully a father who has done nothing but try to manage a difficult, mentally unstable child. These men," he gestured vaguely toward the trustees, "can attest to the records. The medical board has seen the reports. Maya is sitting right here, Julian," I interrupted, my voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal water carafes on the table. "And she is more sane than any man in this room who thought they could profit from her silence." I nodded to the technician at the back of the room. The lights dimmed slightly, and the high-end speaker system, usually reserved for quarterly earnings calls, crackled to life. It wasn't a corporate presentation that filled the room, but the grainy, intercepted audio of a telephone call. Julian's voice filled the space, but it wasn't the voice of the man across from me. It was stripped of its polish, sounding desperate, frantic, and ugly. "I need more time," the recording played, the sound of wind whistling through a phone line in the background. "The trust vests in 3 weeks, 2 million. I told you I'm getting the girl declared incompetent. The doctors are on board. Just tell the hammer I'm good for it. I just need the papers signed." A second voice, rough and cold, responded. "The hammer doesn't like waiting, Julian. You've been chasing your losses for 2 years. If that 2 million doesn't hit the account the day it vests, we aren't coming for your car, we're coming for you." The recording cut off, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I watched Julian's face. The gray I had seen at the shelter had turned into a ghostly, translucent white. He looked at the trustees, but they were already leaning away from him, their faces masks of practiced shock as they tried to distance themselves from the sinking ship. The secret wasn't just the trust, it was the entire network of corruption he had built, the bribed medical board members who signed off on forced sedatives, the trustees who ignored the red flags of his gambling debts, and the cold, calculated way he had turned his own daughter into a commodity to pay off a bookie. I felt Maya's grip on my hand tighten. She wasn't trembling anymore. She was holding on to me with a strength I didn't know she still possessed, her eyes fixed on the man who had tried to sell her soul to save his own skin. I leaned forward, the scent of her lavender soap mixing with the bitter coffee, and I looked Julian straight in the eye. "The hammer is the least of your problems now, Julian. I'm the one you should have been afraid of." The chaos of the arrest, the sharp click of handcuffs, the panicked, undignified shouting of a man who realized too late that his charm had no currency in a court of law eventually faded into a ringing silence. The lawyers had retreated to their mahogany offices to finalize the paperwork that would strip Julian of every legal tie to this family, and the police had taken him away in a flurry of flashing blue and red lights that seemed garish against the stately limestone of my estate. Now the world was quiet. It was that soft, bruised hour of dusk when the sky turns a deep, aching violet and the shadows in the garden stretch long and thin like the fingers of a ghost. Maya and I sat together on the old stone bench near the koi pond, a spot my late husband had insisted on building because the water's surface caught the very last of the day's light. The stone was cool beneath us, smelling faintly of moss and the damp earth of a garden coming into its evening bloom. I watched her out of the corner of my eye. She was wearing one of my old cashmere cardigans. The sleeves swallowed her hands, but she looked more present, more grounded than she had in the months since I'd found her shivering in that shelter. The $2 million was safe now, locked behind a series of legal firewalls that even a man as desperate as Julian could never hope to breach. But as I looked at her, I knew the money was the least of what she needed. "He used to sit right here," I said softly, my voice barely a ripple in the still air. Maya turned her head, her eyes questioning. "Your father, Thomas, when he was a boy, he'd spend hours trying to catch the fish with nothing but a plastic cup and a lot of misplaced optimism." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first genuine expression I'd seen on her face that didn't involve fear or exhaustion. "He never told me that," she whispered. "He always talked about the city. I didn't think he liked the quiet much." "He loved the quiet," I corrected, feeling a familiar pang of grief that had softened over the years into a dull, manageable ache. "He just felt he had to outrun it. He had a restlessness in him, Maya. You have his eyes, that same deep, searching brown, but you have your mother's hair. As the sun took its final dip below the horizon, a single stray beam of amber light lanced through the branches of the ancient oak tree above us. It caught the strands of her hair, igniting the gold hidden within the chestnut brown, making her glow for a brief, transcendent moment. In that light, I didn't see a victim or a girl who had been broken by a father's greed. I saw the woman she was becoming, a woman who had survived a nightmare and emerged with a core of tempered steel. She was the living legacy of my son, the only part of him that the world hadn't been able to take away. I reached out and tucked a loose strand of that golden lit hair behind her ear. Her skin felt warmer now, the pallor of the shelter replaced by a healthy, if fragile, flush. The money, I began, my voice firming, it's just a tool, Maya. Julian saw it as a prize, a way to settle scores and feed his own vanity. But he was wrong. Wealth isn't meant to be a cage or a pedestal. It's meant to be a foundation. I looked around at the sprawling gardens, the high stone walls, and the massive house that had often felt like a museum of my own loneliness. For decades, I had guarded this fortune, growing it, protecting it, and sometimes resenting the weight of it. I had used it for power, for influence, and for the cold satisfaction of winning. But sitting here with my granddaughter, watching the light fade from her hair as the first stars began to prick through the velvet sky, I finally understood its true purpose. It wasn't for the architecture of empires or the vanity of a name. It was for this, for the restoration of a life that had been systematically dismantled. It was for the specialized doctors who would help her unlearn the trauma, for the education she had been denied, and for the simple, quiet security of knowing that she would never have to be afraid of the dark again. My wealth was finally doing what it was always meant to do. It was serving as the medicine for a broken spirit, the bridge back to a world where she could finally breathe. You're safe now, I told her, and for the first time I didn't just mean from Julian. I meant she was safe from the world he had tried to force her into. The wolves are gone, Maya, and I'm not going anywhere. She leaned her head onto my shoulder, a heavy, trusting weight that brought tears to my eyes. We sat there in the deepening indigo of the garden, two women bound by blood and a shared battle, watching the moon rise over the water. The $2 million was a footnote. The real inheritance was the peace we had finally found in the silence. The weeks that followed that night in the garden were a blurred symphony of transition, a slow shedding of old skins. The Sterling estate, which had for so long functioned as a gilded mausoleum for my own regrets, began to pulse with a new, frantic kind of life. We spent the better part of a month renovating the east wing, the section of the house that had remained shuttered since Thomas was a boy. I didn't want Maya tucked away in a guest room that felt like a hotel suite. I wanted her to have a sanctuary that was entirely hers. We replaced the heavy, oppressive velvet drapes with sheer linens that caught the morning light, and we filled the built-in mahogany bookshelves not with my leather-bound collectibles, but with the thick, dog-eared textbooks she would need for the fall semester. She had chosen to study social poli-sci, a choice that made my heart ache with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She wanted to understand the systems that had failed her to ensure they wouldn't fail others. I remember standing in the doorway of her new sitting room, watching her organize a stack of notebooks. The air smelled of fresh paint and the faint, sweet scent of the jasmine vines climbing the trellis outside her window. She looked up, and for the first time, the wary tension in her shoulders had completely dissolved. She wasn't looking for an exit anymore. She was looking at a home. "I found something," she said, her voice steady. She reached into the pocket of the oversized cardigan she still insisted on wearing, the one she'd had since the shelter. She pulled out a small, laminated piece of plastic. It was her shelter identification card. The edges were frayed, the plastic yellowed and cracked from being clutched too tightly in terrified hands. The photo on the front was a haunting reminder of the girl I had found. Her eyes were hollow, her face gaunt, her spirit seemingly extinguished by the sheer weight of survival. "I've been carrying this around like a talisman," she whispered, looking down at the card. "I think I was afraid that if I let it go, I'd wake up back there, that all of this was just a dream I was having while sleeping on a thin mattress in a room full of strangers." "It's not a dream, Maya," I said, stepping into the room and placing a hand on her shoulder. The warmth of her skin through the wool was the only proof I ever needed. "The nightmare is over. You don't need to hold onto the proof of it anymore." We walked together out onto the wide stone balcony that wrapped around her wing. From this height, the city was laid out before us like a sprawling, intricate map of lights and shadows. It was the same city that had swallowed her whole, the same concrete labyrinth where Julian had tried to bury her identity. From here, the distant roar of traffic was nothing more than a low hum, a reminder of a world that could no longer touch her. Maya looked out at the horizon, the wind catching her hair, and then she looked back at the small plastic card in her hand. With a deliberate, slow motion, she leaned over the railing and let it go. We watched it flutter downward, a tiny white speck dancing on the thermal currents before it disappeared into the dark canopy of the gardens below. It was a silent exorcism. The girl in that photo was gone, and in her place stood a young woman who was finally reclaiming her name, her history, and her future. I looked at her profile, silhouetted against the rising moon, and realized that my own transformation was just as profound. For years, I had defined myself by the cold metrics of my success, the acquisitions, the market shares, the sheer, unyielding power of the sterling name. I had viewed the $2 million trust fund as a burden of legacy, a target on my family's back. But as I stood there with my granddaughter, the money felt insignificant in the face of our shared resilience. It was no longer a curse or a lure for predators. It was simply the soil in which she would grow. It was the tuition for her dreams, the security of her health, and the foundation of a life lived on her own terms. The Sterling house was no longer just a structure of stone and glass designed to keep the world at bay. It had become a living thing, filled with the sounds of shared meals, the quiet scratch of pens on paper, and the occasional, miraculous sound of Maya's laughter echoing through the halls. I was no longer just a billionaire guarding a fortress. I was a grandmother, a protector, and a witness to a rebirth. For the first time in a decade, when I looked into the mirrors of this grand old house, I didn't see a woman hardened by the world. I saw a woman who had finally come home. The silence of the estate was no longer the silence of an empty tomb. It was the peaceful, expectant hush of a beginning.